Chapter 4. Nicholas and his uncle, to secure the fortune without loss of time, wait upon Mr. Wackford Squeers, the Yorkshire schoolmaster. There are two things I need to explain before I read the chapter. First of all, the difference between guineas and pounds. A guinea, before 1971, was a pound and a shilling. 20 shillings in a pound, 21 shillings in a guinea. So obviously, if you paid for something in guineas, you paid a lot more than if you paid in pounds. And the second thing that I need to explain is that a reference is made in the second paragraph of this fourth chapter to Newgate Prison. Newgate Prison was the prison from which convicted felons were dragged to be publicly hanged. The Victorians loved a public hanging. It was great sport, great entertainment. But Dickens describes in this second paragraph the awfulness of such an occasion. So, chapter 4. Snow Hill. What kind of place can the quiet townspeople who see the words emblazoned in all the legibility of gilt letters and dark shading on the North Country coaches take Snow Hill to be? All people have some undefined and shadowy notion of a place whose name is frequently before their eyes or often in their ears. What a vast number of random ideas there must be perpetually floating about regarding this same Snow Hill. The name is such a good one, Snow Hill. Snow Hill, too, coupled with the Saracen's Head, picturing to us a double association of ideas, something stern and rugged. A bleak, desolate tract of country, perhaps, open to piercing blasts and fierce wintry storms, a dark, cold, gloomy heath, lonely by day, and scarcely to be thought of by honest folks at night, a place which solitary wayfarers shun, and where desperate robbers congregate. This, or something like this, should be the prevalent notion of Snow Hill in those remote and rustic parts through which the Saracen's Head, like some grim apparition, rushes each day and night with mysterious and ghost-like punctuality, holding its swift and headlong course in all weathers and seeming to bid defiance to the very elements themselves. The reality, however, is different, but by no means to be despised notwithstanding. There, at the very core of London, in the heart of its business and animation, in the midst of a whirl of life that flow ceaselessly on from different quarters and meet beneath its walls, stands Newgate Prison. And in that crowded street on which it frowns so darkly, within a few feet of the tottering houses, upon the very spot on which the vendors of soup and fish and damaged fruit are now plying their trades, scores of human beings, amidst a roar of sounds to which even the tumult of a great city is as nothing, 4, 6, or 8 strong men at a time, are hurried violently and swiftly from this world, when the scene has been rendered frightful with the excess of human life, when curious eyes have glared from every casement and housetop and wall and pillar, and when in the mass of white and upturned faces the dying wretch in his all-comprehensive look of agony has met not one that bore the impress of pity or compassion. Next to the jail, and by consequence near Smithfield also, and the Compter, and the bustle and noise of the city, and just on that particular part of Snow Hill where omnibus horses going eastward seriously think of falling down on purpose, and where horses in Hackney cabriolets going westward not unfrequently fall by accident, just there is the coachyard of the Saracen's Head Inn. Its portal guarded by two Saracens' heads and shoulders, which it was once the pride and glory of the choice spirits of this metropolis to pull down at night, but which for some time have remained in undisturbed tranquillity, possibly because this species of humour is now confined to St. James's Parish, where door-knockers are preferred as being more portable, and bell wires esteemed as convenient toothpicks. Whether this be the reason or not, they were frowning upon you from each side of the gateway. The inn itself was garnished with another Saracen's head frowning upon you from the top of the yard, while from the door at the hind boot of all the red coaches that are standing therein, there glares a small Saracen's head, with a twin expression to the large Saracen's heads below. So the general appearance of the pile is decidedly of the Saracenic order. When you walk up this yard, you will see the booking office on your left, and the tower of St. Sepulchre's Church darting abruptly into the sky on your right, and a gallery of bedrooms on either side. Just before you, you will observe a long window with the words "Coffee Room" legibly painted above it. And looking out of that window, you would have seen, in addition, if you had gone at the right time, Mr. Wackford Squeers, with his hands in his pockets. Mr. Squeers' appearance was not prepossessing. He had but one eye, and the popular prejudice runs to two. The eye was unquestionably useful, but decidedly not ornamental, being of a greenish grey, and in shape resembling the fanlight of a street door. The blank side of his face was much wrinkled and puckered up, which gave him a very sinister experience, especially when he smiled, at which times his expression bordered closely on the villainous. His hair was very flat and shiny, save at the ends, where it was brushed stiffly from a low, protruding forehead, which assorted well with his harsh voice and coarse manner. He was about 2 or 3 and 50, a trifle below middle size. He wore a white neckerchief with long ends and a suit of scholastic black, but his coat sleeves being a great deal too long and his trousers a great deal too short, he appeared ill at ease at his clothes, and as if he were in a perpetual state of astonishment at finding himself so respectable. Mr. Squeers was standing in a cabin or alcove by one of the coffee room fireplaces, fitted in with a table, as is usually seen in coffee rooms, and 2 of extraordinary shapes and dimensions made to suit the angles of the partition. In a corner of the seat was a very small deal trunk, tied round with a scanty piece of cord, and on the trunk was perched his lace cap, half boots, and corduroy trousers dangling in the air, and his hands planted on his knees, his shoulders drawn up to his ears, glancing timidly at the schoolmaster from time to time, was a diminutive boy, filled with evident dread and apprehension. 3:30, muttered Mr. Squeers, turning from one window and looking sulkily at the coffee-room clock. There'll be nobody appearing here today. Much vexed by this recollection, Mr. Squeers looked at the little boy to see what he was doing, whether he was doing anything he could beat him for. As he appeared not to be doing anything at all, he merely boxed his ears and told him not to do it again. At midsummer, muttered Mr. Squeers, resuming his complaint, I took down 10 boys. 10 20s is £200. I go back tomorrow morning with only 3. 3 oughts is ought. 2 3 6s. Well, that's only £60. What's to come of all these boys? What's the parents got in their heads? What does it all mean? Here, the little boy on the top of the trunk gave a violent sneeze. Hello, sir, growled the schoolmaster, turning round. What's that, sir? Nothing, please, sir, said the little boy. Nothing, sir, exclaimed Mr. Squeers. Please, sir, I sneezed, rejoined the boy, trembling till the little trunk shook underneath him. Oh, you sneezed, did you? Retorted Mr. Squeers. Then what did you say nothing for? In a default of a better answer to this question, the little boy screwed up two couple of knuckles into each eye and began to cry. Wherefore Mr. Squeers knocked him off the trunk with one blow on one side of his face and knocked him back on the trunk with the blow on the other. Wait till I get you down to Yorkshire, my young gentleman, said Mr. Squeers, and then I'll give you the rest. Will you hold that noise, sir? Yes, sobbed the little boy, rubbing his face very hard with his pocket handkerchief. Then do so at once, said Mr. Squeers. Do you hear? As this admonition was accompanied with a threatening gesture and uttered with a savage aspect, the little boy rubbed his face harder as if to keep the tears back, and beyond alternately sniffing and choking, gave no further vent to his emotions. Mr. Squeers, said the waiter, looking in at this juncture, there's a gentleman asking for you at the bar. Oh, show him in, Richard, replied Mr. Squeers in a soft voice. Put your handkerchief in your pocket, you little rascal, or I'll murder you when the gentleman goes. The schoolmaster had scarcely uttered these words in a fierce whisper when the stranger entered. Affecting not to see him, Mr. Squeers feigned to be intent upon mending a pen and offering benevolent advice to his youthful pupil. My dear child, said Mr. Squeers, all people have their trials. This early trial of yours, that is fit to make you a little heart break, and your very eyes to come out of your head with crying. What is it? Nothing, less than nothing. You are leaving your friends, but you will have a father in me, my dear, and a mother in Mrs. Squeers, at the delightful village of Dotheboys, near Greta Bridge in Yorkshire, where youth are boarded, clothed, booked, washed, furnished with pocket money, provided with all necessities. Is this the gentleman? Observed the stranger, stopping the schoolmaster in the rehearsal of his advertisement. Mr. Squeers, I believe. The same, sir, said Mr. Squeers, with an assumption of great surprise. The gentleman, said the stranger, that advertised in the Times newspaper, Morning Post, Chronicle, Herald, and Advertiser, regarding the academy called Dotheboys Hall at the delightful village of Dotheboys, near Greta Bridge in Yorkshire. added Mr. Squeers. "You come on business, I see by my young friends here. How do you do, my little gentleman, and how do you do, sir?" With this salutation, Mr. Squeers patted the heads of two hollow-eyed, small-boned little boys, whom the applicant had brought with him, and waited for further communication. "I am in the oil and colour way. My name is Snawley, sir," said the stranger. Squeers inclined his head as much as to say, "And a remarkably pretty name, too." The stranger continued, "I have been thinking, Mr. Squeers, of placing my two boys at your school." "It is not for me to say so, sir," replied Mr. Squeers, "but I don't think you could possibly do a better thing." Said the other. £20 per annum, I believe, Mr. Squeers. Why, guineas," rejoined the schoolmaster with a persuasive smile. "Pounds for two, I think, Mr. Squeers," said Mr. Snawley solemnly. I don't think it could be done, sir," replied Squeers, as if he'd never considered the proposition before. Let me see. 5 fours is 20, double that, and deduct the well, £1 either way we shall not stand 'twixt us. You must recommend me to your connection, sir, and make it up that way." "They're not great eaters," said Mr. Snawley. "Oh, that doesn't matter at all," replied Squeers. "We don't consider the boys' appetites on our establishment." That was strictly true. They certainly didn't. "Every wholesome luxury, sir, that Yorkshire can afford," continued Squeers. "Every beautiful moral that Mrs. Squeers can instil, in short, every comfort of a home that a boy could wish for will be theirs, Mr. Snawley." "I should wish their morals to be particularly attended to," said Mr. Snawley. "I'm glad of that, sir," replied the schoolmaster, drawing himself up. You have come to the right shop for morals, sir." "You are a moral man yourself," said Mr. Snawley. I rather believe I am, sir," replied Squeers. "I have the satisfaction to know you are, sir," said Mr. Snawley. "I asked one of your references, and he said you were pious." Well, sir, I hope I am a little in that line," replied Squeers. "I hope I am too," replied the other. "Could I say a few words with you in the next room?" "By all means," rejoined Squeers with a grin. "My dears, you will speak to your new playfellow a minute or two. That is one of my boys, sir. Bellin is his name. A Taunton boy, that, sir." "Is he indeed?" rejoined Mr. Snawley, looking at the poor little urchin as if he were some extraordinary natural curiosity. "He goes down with me to-morrow, sir," said Squeers. "That's his luggage that he's sitting on now. Each boy is required to bring, sir, 2 suits of clothes, 6 shirts, 6 pairs of stockings, 2 nightcaps, 2 pocket handkerchiefs, 2 pairs of shoes, 2 hats, and a razor." "A razor!" exclaimed Mr. Snawley, as they walked into the next room. "What for?" "To shave with," replied Squeers in a low and measured tone. There was not much in these 3 words, but there must have been something in the manner in which they were said to attract attention, for the schoolmaster and his companion looked steadily at each other for a few seconds, and then exchanged a very meaningful smile. Snawley was a sleek, flat-nosed man, clad in sombre garments and long black gaiters, and bearing in his countenance an expression of much mortification and sanctity, so his smiling without any obvious reason was all the more remarkable. "Up to what age do you keep boys at your school, then?" he asked at length. just as long as their friends make the quarterly payments to my agent in town, or until such time as they run away," replied Squeers. "Let us understand each other. I see we may safely do so. These boys, are they natural children?" "No," replied Mr. Snawley, meeting the gaze of the schoolmaster's one eye. "They ain't." "Oh, I thought there might be," said Squeers coolly. "We have a good many of them." "That boy's one." "Him in the next room?" said Snawley. Squeers nodded in the affirmative. His companion took another peep at the little boy on the trunk, and turning round again, looked as if he were quite disappointed to see him so much like other boys, and said he would hardly have thought it. "He is," cried Squeers. But about these boys of yours, you wanted to speak to me?" "Yes," replied Snawley. "The fact is, I am not their father, Mr. Squeers. I am their stepfather." "Oh, is that it?" said the schoolmaster. "That explains it at once. I was wondering what the devil you was sending them to Yorkshire for. Oh, well, I understand now." "Yes, I have married their mother," pursued Snawley. "It's expensive keeping boys at home, and as she has a little money in her own right, I'm afraid women are so very foolish, Mr. Squeers. I'm afraid she might be led to squander it on them, and that would be to their ruin, you know." "Oh, I see," returned Squeers, throwing himself back in his chair and waving his hand. "And this," resumed Snawley, "has made me anxious to put them at some school a good distance off, where there are no holidays, none of those ill-judged comings and goings twice a year that unsettle children's minds so, and where they may rough it a little. You comprehend?" "The payments being regular, and no questions asked," said Squeers, nodding his head. "That's it exactly," rejoined the other. "Morals strictly attended to, though." "Oh, strictly," said Squeers. "Not too much writing home allowed, I hope," said the stepfather, hesitating. "None, except a circular at Christmas to say they were never so happy and hope they may never be sent for," rejoined Squeers. "Nothing could be better," said the stepfather, rubbing his hands. "Then, as we understand each other," said Squeers, "will you allow me to ask you to consider me being a highly virtuous, exemplary, and well-educated man in private life, and whether, as a person whose business it is to take charge of youth, you place the strongest confidence in my unimpeachable integrity, liberality, religious principles, and ability?" "Certainly I do," replied the stepfather, reciprocating the schoolmaster's grin. "Perhaps you won't object to say that if I ask you for a reference?" "Not the least in the world." "That's your sort," said Squeers, taking up a pen. "This is doing business, and that's what I like." Having entered Mr. Snawley's address, the schoolmaster had next to perform that still more agreeable office of entering the receipt for the first quarter's payment in advance, which he had scarcely completed when another voice was heard inquiring for Mr. Squeers. "Here he is," replied the schoolmaster. "What is it?" "Only a matter of business, sir," said Ralph Nickleby, presenting himself, closely followed by Nicholas. "There was an advertisement. I think you put an advertisement in the papers this morning." "I did, sir. This way, if you please," said Squeers, who had by this time got back into the alcove by the fireplace. "Won't you be seated?" "Why, I think I will," replied Ralph, suiting the action to the word and placing his hat on the table before him. "This is my nephew, Mr. Nicholas Nickleby." "How do you do, sir?" said Mr. Squeers. Nicholas bowed, said he was very well, and seemed very much astonished at the outward appearance of the proprietor of Dotheboys Hall, as indeed he was. "Perhaps you recollect me," said Ralph, looking narrowly at the schoolmaster. "Oh, yes, I do recollect you. You've been paying me a small account at each of my half-yearly visits to town for some years now, I think, sir," replied Squeers. "Yes, I did, but I do so no longer," rejoined Ralph. "It was for the parents of a boy named Dorker, who unfortunately died at Dotheboys Hall," said Ralph, finishing the sentence. "I remember it very well, sir," rejoined Squeers. "Oh, Mrs. Squeers, sir, she was so partial to that lad as if he had been her own. The attention, sir, that was bestowed upon that boy in his illness. Dry toast and warm tea offered him every night and morning when he couldn't swallow anything. A candle in his bedroom on the very night he died. The best dictionary sent up for him to lay his head upon. I don't regret it, though. It's a pleasing thing to reflect upon, that one has done one's duty by him." Ralph smiled, as if he meant anything but smiling, and looked round at the strangers present. "These are some pupils of mine," said Wackford Squeers, pointing to the little boy on the trunk and the two little boys on the floor, who had been staring at each other without uttering a word, and writhing their bodies into the most remarkable contortions, according to the custom of little boys when they first become acquainted. This gentleman, sir, is a parent who is kind enough to compliment me on the course of education adopted at Dotheboys Hall, which is situated, sir, at the delightful village of Dotheboys, near Greta Bridge in Yorkshire, where youth are boarded, clothed, booked, washed, furnished with pocket money." Yes, we know all about that," interrupted Ralph testily. "It's in the advertisement." "You are very right, sir. It is in the advertisement," replied Squeers. "And in the matter of fact, beside," interrupted Mr. Snawley, "I feel bound to assure you, sir, and I am proud to have this opportunity of assuring you, that I consider Mr. Squeers a gentleman highly virtuous, exemplary, well conducted." "I make no doubt of it," interrupted Ralph, checking the torrent of recommendation. "No doubt of it at all. Suppose we come to business." "With all my heart, sir," rejoined Squeers. "Never postpone business. It is the very first lesson we instil in our commercial pupils. Master Bellin, my dear, always remember that. Do you hear? Can you remember this? Never postpone business." "Yes, sir," repeated Master Belling. "He recollects what it is, does he?" said Ralph. "Tell the gentleman," said Squeers. "Never," repeated Master Belling. "Very good," said Squeers. "Go on." "Never," repeated Master Belling again. "Very good," said Squeers. "Yes." "Pah! Pah!" suggested Nicholas good-humouredly.
Perform business, said Master Belling. Never perform business.
That is not right. Very well, sir, said Squeers, darting a withering look at the culprit. You and I will perform a little business on our private account by and by. Just now, said Ralph, we'd better transact our own business. If you please, sir, said Squeers. Well, said Ralph, it's brief enough, soon broached, and I hope soon concluded. You have advertised for an able assistant, sir. Precisely so, said Squeers. And you really want one? Oh, certainly, answered Squeers. Well, here he is, said Ralph. My nephew Nicholas, hot from school with everything he learnt fermenting in his head and nothing fermenting in his pocket. He's just the man you want. I am afraid, said Squeers, perplexed at such an application from a youth of Nicholas's figure. I am afraid the young man won't suit me. Yes, he will, said Ralph. I know better. Don't be cast down, sir. You'll be teaching all the young noblemen in Dotheboys Hall in less than a week's time, unless this gentleman's more obstinate than I take him to be. I fear, sir, said Nicholas, addressing Mr. Squeers, that you object to my youth and to my not being a Master of Arts. The absence of a university degree is an objection, replied Mr. Squeers, looking as grave as he could and considerably puzzled, no less by the contrast between the simplicity of the nephew and the worldly manner of the uncle than by the incomprehensible allusion to the young noblemen who were being taught at Dotheboys Hall. Look here, sir, said Ralph. I'll put this matter in true light in 2 seconds. If you'll have the goodness, rejoined Squeers. There is a boy, or a youth, or a lad, or a young man, or a hobbledehoy, or whatever you call him, of 18 or 19 or hereabouts, said Ralph. That I see, observed the schoolmaster. So do I, said Mr. Snawley, thinking it well to back up his new friend occasionally. His father is dead. He is wholly ignorant of the world, has no resources whatever, and wants something to do, replied Ralph. I recommend him to this splendid establishment of yours as an opening which will eventually lead to fortune if he turns it to proper account. Do you see that? Everyone must see that, replied Squeers, half imitating the sneer with which the old gentleman was regarding his unconscious relative. I do, of course, said Nicholas eagerly. He does, of course, you observe, said Ralph, much in the same dry, hard manner. If any caprice of temper should induce him to cast this golden opportunity aside before he has brought it to perfection, I consider myself absolved from extending any assistance to his mother and sister. Look at him. Think of the use you may put to him. He'll be useful in a dozen ways. Now, the question is, whether for some time to come, at all events, he won't serve your purpose better than 20 of the kind of people you would get under ordinary circumstances. Isn't that a question for consideration? Yes, I suppose it is, said Squeers, answering a nod of Ralph's head with a nod of his own. Good, rejoined Ralph. Let me have 2 words with you. The 2 words were had apart. In a couple of minutes Mr. Wackford Squeers announced that Mr. Nicholas Nickleby was, from that moment, thoroughly nominated to and installed in the office of First Assistant Master at Dotheboys Hall. Your uncle's recommendation have won this for you, Mr. Nickleby, said Mr. Wackford Squeers. Nicholas, overjoyed at his success, shook his uncle's hand warmly, and could almost have worshipped Squeers upon the spot. He's an odd-looking man, thought Nicholas. What of that? Pawson was an odd-looking man, and so was Dr. Johnson. All these bookworms are. "At 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Mr. Nickleby," said Squeers. "The coach starts. You must be here a quarter of an hour before, as we take these boys with us."
"Certainly, sir," said Nicholas.
"And your fare down I have paid," growled Ralph. "So you'll have nothing to do but keep yourself warm." Here was another instance of his uncle's generosity. Nicholas felt his unexpected kindness so much that he could scarcely find words to thank him. Indeed, he hadn't found half enough when they took leave of the schoolmaster and emerged from the Saracen's Head gateway. "I shall be thinking of you here in the morning. I shall be here to see you fairly off," said Ralph. No skulking."
"Thank you, sir," replied Nicholas. "I shall never forget your kindness."
"Take care you don't," replied his uncle. "You'd better go home now and pack what you've got to pack. Do you think you can find your way to Golden Square, to my home, first?"
"Certainly," said Nicholas. "I can easily inquire."
"Leave these papers with my clerk," said Ralph, producing a small parcel. "Tell him to wait till I come home." Nicholas cheerfully undertook the errand, and bidding his worthy uncle an affectionate farewell, which that warm-hearted old gentleman acknowledged with a growl, hastened away to execute his commission. He found Golden Square in due course. Mr. Noggs, who had stepped out for a moment or so to the public house, was opening the door with a latch key as he reached the steps. "What's that?" inquired Noggs, pointing to the parcel.
"Papers from my uncle," replied Nicholas, "and you're supposed to have the goodness to wait until he comes home, if you please."
"Uncle?"
cried Noggs. "Mr. Nickleby," said Nicholas in explanation.
"Come in,"
said Newman. Without another word he led Nicholas into the passage, and thence into the official pantry at the end of it, where he thrust him into a chair, and mounting upon his high stool, sat with his arms hanging straight down by his sides, gazing fixedly upon him, as from a tower of observation. "There is no answer," said Nicholas, laying the parcel on the table beside him. Newman said nothing, but folding his arms and thrusting his head forward so as to obtain a nearer view of Nicholas' face, scanned his features closely. "Is there no answer?" said Nicholas. "No answer that I need to take to my uncle?" speaking very loud under the impression that Newman Noggs was deaf. Newman placed his hands upon his knees, and without uttering a syllable, continued the same close scrutiny of Nicholas' face. This was such a very singular proceeding on the part of an utter stranger, and his appearance was so extremely peculiar, that Nicholas, who had a sufficiency and a keen sense of the ridiculous, couldn't refrain from breaking into a smile as he inquired whether Mr. Noggs had any commands that he could take back to his uncle. Noggs shook his head and sighed, upon which Nicholas rose, and remarking that he had required no rest, bade him good morning. It was a great exertion for Newman Noggs, and nobody knows to this day how he ever came to make it, the other party being wholly unknown to him. But he drew a long breath, and actually said out loud, without stopping, that if the young gentleman didn't object to tell, he should like to know what his uncle was going to do for him. Nicholas had not the least objection in the world, but on the contrary was rather pleased to have an opportunity of talking on the subject which occupied his thoughts. So he sat down again, and, his sanguine imagination warming as he spoke, entered into a fervent and glowing description of all the honours and advantages to be derived from his appointment at that seat of learning, Dotheboys Hall. "But what's the matter? Are you ill?" said Nicholas, suddenly breaking off as his companion, after throwing himself into a variety of uncouth attitudes, thrust his hands under the stool and cracked his finger joints as if he were snapping all his bones at once. Newman Noggs made no reply, but went on shrugging his shoulders and cracking his finger joints, smiling horribly all the time, and looking steadfastly at one out of the tops of his eyes in a ghastly manner. At first, Nicholas thought that the mysterious man was in a fit, but on further consideration decided that he was in liquor, under which circumstances he deemed it prudent to make off at once. He looked back when he had got to the street door. Newman Noggs was still indulging in the same extraordinary gestures, and the cracking of his fingers sounded louder than ever.